I really want to kind of have, instead of a preacher-congregation interaction this morning, I'd like to have kind of like a teacher-class interaction. I'd like to explore this passage together with maybe a little bit of interaction. And I think a smaller crowd kind of lends itself to that. So turn on your student interactive participation personalities. And we're going to work together through this. When I started studying the book of Esther, this was the sermon that I was excited to get to. This is the part that I think is really powerful and amazing. And I can't wait to kind of open it up and explore it together. I've talked to you before about chiasms. Chiasms come from the Greek word or letter chi, which is the X. And you kind of have half of an X, but I've kind of tipped it, and if you view it kind of as climbing a mountain and then going back down the mountain, you climb the mountain and you get to the peak, which is kind of the central part of the story. That what the chiasm is kind of, it funnels you to the central point. And so we'll kind of picture it as climbing a mountain. We get to the peak, we get to the central point, and then we'll go back down the mountain. And you kind of see that if you turn your hand out sideways, you kind of see we're going to climb the mountain, we're going to come back down the mountain, and the central point there is in the middle. What I'd like to do is, instead of just telling you, hey, here's one side of the mountain and here's the other side of the mountain, I'd like to tell you the first part, and then I'd like you guys to find the corresponding second part. Okay? So in a chiasm, you think of it like this: A, B, C, and then D is the middle. And then you go back to C, B, A. Does that make sense? A, B, C, D, C, B, A. So A and A correspond to each other, B and B correspond to each other, C and C correspond, and then D is the central point. So as we're going to get into it here, the first point is in chapter 3, 7 to 15. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast Pur before Haman. Let's jump to verse 12. Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and an edict according to all that Haman commanded was written to the king's satraps and to the governors over all the provinces and to the officials of all the peoples, to every province in its own script and every people in its own language. It was written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instruction to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all peoples to be ready for that day. The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. There's A. Now your job, where is the corresponding A? What corresponds to this passage later in the book? There is another decree written, just like the decree written in chapter 3. Whitney, what did you say? Okay, let's go to chapter 8. What verses in chapter 8 should we look at, Whitney?
Chapter 8, verse 8.
You may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king and seal it with the king's ring, for an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. The king's scribes were summoned at that time in the 3rd month. Notice the king's scribes, it gives a date. This is almost verbatim what we read in chapter 3. The king's scribes were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day. And an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded. What's different? Mordecai takes over Haman's place. You flip back to chapter 3, according to all that Haman had written. Here, according to all that Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews, to the satraps and the governors and the officials of the provinces, from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces. So each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring. He sent letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, kill, and to annihilate. Where have you heard those words before? These are the exact words that were written in the first decree. To destroy, to kill, to annihilate, where am I? Any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods one day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. A copy of what was written was to be issued as a decree in every province, being publicly displayed to all peoples, and the Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their swift horses that were used in the king's service, rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. When you're reading the Bible and you hit one passage and then you read, and you hit another passage and it sounds like an exact mirror image of something you read before, that ought to catch your attention. You ought to say, wait a minute, why is he repeating himself? Why is he saying exactly what I read before? Sometimes it's just for the sake of repetition. And instead of bold, or instead of underlining things, or instead of writing in italics, which is often the way today that we tell the reader, pay attention, look at this is important, I want you to remember this. You'd use repetition. You'd say it over, and then you'd say it over, and then you'd say it over. One of the mechanisms they had to get your attention was this chiasm. So you read this in chapter 3, and then in chapter 8, you read almost verbatim the same exact words. And what that does is it helps us because it gives us boundaries. We know that the chiasm, and you can look, there's a few things before chapter 3 and a few things after these verses that correspond, but it gets really tight between chapter 3 and chapter 8. You say, okay, this is the beginning boundary, and chapter 8 is the end boundary. Now we're going to work towards the middle. So you're not going to look after this. Where are you going to look for the corresponding points? You're going to look before. So the next point isn't going to come after this, it's going to come before this. All right. So royal edict is to destroy the Jews. Haman is given the king's ring to seal the law with. And what's interesting is even the king himself can't go back and annul the law that he made. He has to make another law to kind of counteract the previous law. So once that ring seals the document and it goes out, you can't just go out and say, hey, wait a minute, I changed my mind. That law doesn't work anymore. Now he has to write another law to say, that law is still in effect. You're still allowed to kill the Jews on the 13th day of Adar. But now this law says the Jews are supposed to defend themselves and kill anyone who tries to kill them. Chapter 5, verse 1. We talked about this a lot last Sunday. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room, opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. 5:1. The king holds out the golden scepter to Esther. Where's the corresponding point? That's a good guess. Brad's going to say it's in chapter 8. One and 2 doesn't have it, but you're close. 8:4. Can you read that, Daylin? Okay, 8:4, the king extends the golden scepter. When you read that, golden scepter, wait a minute. There's only one other place in this book that I've heard golden scepter. Golden scepter, golden scepter. All right, 5 through 8. Then the king said, bring Haman quickly so that we may do as Esther has asked. So king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, what is your wish? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Even to half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled. What is this? This is the first feast that Esther throws, right? This one's a gimme. What's going to come later on that's going to correspond to the first feast? The second feast. Good, Judy. And where is the second feast? Chapter? The second feast. There we go. Chapter 7. What verses? So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said, "What is your wish? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." You see how it's like a funnel. He's tightening us in. We've got the royal edict, copied by the royal edict. Esther approaches. The first feast, the second feast. Look at 5:10-13. So the first feast has happened. Haman comes home from the first feast on cloud 9. He's loving life. We'll look at verse 9. Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Verse 10, nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. So Haman meets with his friends and his wife. His wife's name is given to us. It's Zeresh. Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons. Do you think Zeresh needed to be reminded the number of his sons? So he tells his wife how many sons he has, and all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. What would correspond to that? What corresponds to Haman telling his wife how many sons he has and how rich he is and how many blessings he has in his life? This one, you got to work a little harder than the first feast, second feast one.
Chapter 7, verse 6.
Well, we have to go backwards from 7:1 and 2. 7:1 and 2 was our last one, so it's got to come before 7:1 and 2.
Verse 13 is where it tells us why all of that things happened.
Okay, look at 6. Then 6:12. Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. Do you remember in chapter 5, what does it say about Haman? It says, Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. Something has changed in Haman's story. Haman goes joyful and glad of heart. Chapter 6, Haman returns to his house mourning and with his head covered. And Haman told his wife, and we're given her name again, told his wife Zeresh. These are all triggers. These are telling you, wait a minute, I remember reading that. They're corresponding anchor points. Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. So in chapter 5, he says, everybody come together. I want to tell you how great my life is. I want to tell you how rich I am. I want to tell you how many sons I have. I want to tell you all the fortune that God has given to me, or that Xerxes, or I don't know what the Xerxes God is. And then in chapter 6, Haman gets his whole family together and he tells them his misfortune. He recounts to them, this is how bad my life is. This is what just happened to me. Now, back in chapter 5, when he tells his family all the great things that have happened, how great things is, he says, yet all that is, verse 12, sorry, chapter 5, verse 12. Even Queen Esther, let no one but me. You've got to, if you know the story, you start snickering here, because he's so honored that Queen Esther has invited him to this feast. Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared. Tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made. And some texts say gallows, some texts say stake, so either way it's an instrument of death. And in the morning tell the king, do you hear that? In the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. What is King Xerxes? What have we talked about the whole time? What is he? Who said it? Yes, Xerxes is a puppet. Xerxes, throughout the book, you play Xerxes. So the wife, Zeresh, is saying, just go tell King Xerxes what to do, like you always do. You want Mordecai to die? Go tell him to kill Mordecai, and he'll do it. You know that he'll do what you tell him to do. So tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Look at this. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast. This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. So in 5:14, we have the plan to kill Mordecai. Now we're backing up from 6:12 to 13. What corresponds to a plan to kill Mordecai? Not quite yet. Nope. Backing up from 6:12 to 13. Look at the text. What happens right before that? Instead of a plan to kill Mordecai, it's a plan. There's a plan discovered. There's a plan concocted by Haman himself, unwittingly, of how should we honor Mordecai. So Haman and his wife and children, or his wife and friends, come up with a plan. We're going to build gallows, we're going to build a stake, and we're going to kill Mordecai. And then in 6 to 11, Haman came in, and the king said, "What shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor?" And Haman said, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set, and let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" So Haman comes up with a plan to honor Mordecai, corresponding to his wife and friends coming up with a plan to kill Mordecai. We're getting funneled in, and now we've only got 5 verses between 5:14 and 6:6. Look at 5:14, it's the very last verse of chapter 5. 6:6, what's in between those verses? What's the center of this chiasm? No, well, yes, the account of that. So chapter 6, verses 1 to 5 is the center. So let's read those verses together. This is where the author has brought us. You guys see that? I mean, these correlations, sometimes you have to kind of, squint a little bit to see the chiasm, like, oh yeah, that kind of corresponds. I can see how those two things correspond. This is probably one of the clearest chiasms I've ever seen as far as word for word correlations between A and A1, B and B1, C and C1, D and D1, bring us to the center. On that night, the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king, and it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh. Wouldn't you love the name Bigthana? I think that's a cool name. Bigthana. 2 of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" The king's young men who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." And the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's young men told him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." These are the 5 verses that the whole story changes on. These are the 5 verses that especially this account of Haman's fortune switches on these 5 verses. What's going on? What's happening here? What's interesting is, remember, we've talked about Xerxes being a puppet. We've talked about all of his ideas come from someone else. All of his ideas are fed to him, except for this one. No one tells him, "Hey, have somebody go get the books for you." This is the only time in the whole book that you actually see him initiating something. They actually see Xerxes saying, "You know what? I want this to happen." And what he wants to happen is for the memorable deeds to be read back to him. Now, look at all the lucky things that happen right here. Look at all the good luck. That he couldn't sleep, that he had the books read to him, that the chance they had of reading the books, they luckily found the chance that had Mordecai in it, and they luckily read that to him. And then when he wanted to find someone to help him come up with an idea of how to honor someone, luckily Haman was just walking in at that time. Do you see how much good luck is in these 5 verses? Why did he have the books read to him? Because he couldn't sleep. Have you ever not been able to sleep? You want to sleep, you're trying to sleep. And I imagine he's probably like, you know what would put me to sleep? Let's get some of the official records out and read to me some official records, and I'll be asleep in no time. So he asked for official records to be read to him, thinking that maybe that'll put me back to sleep, or maybe it'll just be fun to hear about some of the great things that have happened in my kingdom. The author is pushing us to see the hand of God here. Haman comes in and his wife says, just go play the puppet. Just go pull the string and have Xerxes do whatever you want him to do, just like you always get him to do what you want to do. But what Haman doesn't realize is, while Haman has been away, someone else has grabbed the strings of the puppet. There's another puppet master who is now pulling strings, and Haman comes thinking, I'll just get Xerxes to do what I want him to do, like I always get Xerxes to do what I want him to do. And all of a sudden, Xerxes has his own idea and is doing his own thing, and he says, I want to honor someone. Tell me how I can honor someone. And Haman's thinking, playing right into my little hands, I'll just play him like a puppet, I'll get him to do what I want him to do, not realizing that there is another puppet master. So that's your next point. The pivot of this story is when God steps in and becomes the puppet master. I think one of the most beautiful sentences in the whole book is 6:1. And on that night, the king could not sleep. I believe that's God's hand, preventing the king from sleeping. Do you realize what a pivotal moment this is in the story? In a good story, there's conflict and there's resolution, right? This is basic, thank you, storytelling. Is that the official word for it? Storytelling. Basic storytelling. You develop conflict and then you give resolution. But have you noticed in a lot of movies and a lot of stories, I'm looking at you, Thane, in a lot of stories, you develop conflict and then you bring resolution, but you don't bring final resolution. You get the reader to kind of be like, oh, good, everything's going to work out, but you're saving the punch. And just when they kind of put their guard down, and just when they kind of think like, oh, everything's going to be okay, then you come with the real conflict. And you're like, and everything is upside down. Movies do this all the time. They'll introduce a problem, and then they'll solve the problem. And our kids have even picked up on it. About the middle of the movie, everything's going great. You know, they'll have the love sequence where the two people fly kites together and they fall in love and bake cookies. If you're watching a Hallmark movie channel and the two people bake cookies together, forget about it. They're gonna fall in love. I don't know what happens when you bake cookies with someone. But as soon as two people in a Hallmark movie bake cookies, they are destined for love. So, right about that point, the kids have picked up and they say, what's going to happen? I know there's something coming, because movie makers don't give you an hour of peaceful, and this is how happy they were together. They create conflict, they resolve the conflict, and then they create the big conflict. And you're kind of waiting for the big conflict. So in Esther, we've got Haman wanting to kill all the Jews. That's the conflict. And then you have Esther accepted by the king, and you start to let your guard down, like, oh, good. The king didn't kill Esther. Remember, the golden scepter is extended to her. Everything's going to be okay. But then she has a party, a feast. So they go to the first feast, and she doesn't ask for her favor. She doesn't ask in the king's throne room. She doesn't ask at the first feast. She says, come to a second feast. But in between the first feast and the second feast, what happens? What's the big conflict that comes about? Haman decides, I really can't stand Mordecai. I want Mordecai dead. And his family tells him, too easy. Build a gallows, build a stake, whatever gory method of death you want to pick between the different versions of the translations. And tomorrow morning, kill him on it. What's the problem with tomorrow morning? Is Esther's plan going to save Mordecai? It's going to be too late. Esther has a party planned for the evening. Do you get the tension? So as chapter 5 closes, and it says, let a gallows be 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it, then go joyfully with the king to the feast. This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. As a reader, oh no, Esther's plan is not going to save Mordecai. Esther's feast tomorrow night is not going to save Mordecai's life tomorrow morning. And Haman gets the king to do whatever Haman wants the king to do. What in the world is going to happen? How is Mordecai going to be saved? You have the conflict that Esther is not going to be able to save Mordecai. She may be able to save the Jews, but Mordecai is going to die. And then in the middle of all that, you see that Esther is not the only one working to save the Jews. You see that Esther is not, everything is not riding on Esther's plan. God has not put all of his eggs in Esther. God has not trusted Esther to take care of everything and said, it's all riding on you. God himself is working to save his people. So the second thing I want you to write is God is not just working through you. God is working beyond you. So often we feel like God is somehow at our, what's the word? Jeopardy. Like if we don't get God's plan done, it's not going to happen. Like God is sitting in heaven, rubbing his hands, rocking back and forth, hoping we take care of his plan. And if that were the God we serve, then as noble and as courageous as Esther had been, her plan did not see this event coming. Her plan to say, I'm not going to ask the first time, I'm not going to ask the second time, I'm going to wait till the third time, would have cost Mordecai his life. If God had not been working, not just through Esther, but beyond Esther. And there's a beautiful confidence that comes knowing that, yes, I am part of God's plan and God will work his plan through me. And as Mordecai told Esther, maybe you've been put in life for just this time and God's plan is going to be carried out through you. That's the impetus we need to work and to act and to be courageous and to step out and to be bold. But there's also this rest and this confidence that comes from God's not just working through me. It's not all riding on me. That God himself is working beyond me, beyond what I can do, and the places that I can't change, and the things that I can't take care of, and the people that I can't know, the crazy ideas they're going to come up with in the middle of the night. That God works beyond us. That God takes care of things that we cannot take care of. That God keeps kings awake at night to accomplish what he wants to do. And it gives us this peace of saying God is on the throne, God is taking care of me, God is taking care of his plan, and while I'm invited and charged to be a part of it, it is not riding on me. God will accomplish his plan even through the holes in my plan, even through the failures and weaknesses that I introduce. So as beautiful as these 5 verses is, and as much as of a reversal, one of the things I've been learning in my seminary classes is about the different genres of writing. And there's tragedy, Romeo and Juliet. It's just a sad story. It starts happy. You have all these happy things happening. Starts high and it goes low, and you end just crying basically. And there's a lot of tragedy in the world. Creation and the fall is this tragic story of starting so beautifully and going down. And then there's comedy, not like sitcom comedy, but comedy as in things work out. And comedy starts low and it starts sad, and then you see it go up, and it ends with feasts, it ends with weddings, it ends with life, it ends with joy. And usually in a comedy, in a comic story, there's some kind of a reversal. There's 2 things that you can usually say, oh, I'm watching a comedy, or I'm reading a comedy. There's usually mistaken identities, where you don't know, or the people in the story don't know who they're actually dealing with. You have that with Esther. They don't know that she's a Jew, and so they mistake Esther for not being a Jew, and then the reveal is that she is a Jew. And then you have reversals, things that you expect to go one way, and it turns and goes another way. What reversals are there in these chapters? I could see some of you, I'm literature boring, and you're like, oh my word, I thought I was done with lit class. Do you guys see the reversals? Haman's fortune. The king couldn't sleep at night. And Haman's fortune. Do you see? I mean, this is written to be funny. When Haman comes in and says, let me tell you how to honor someone, and he comes up with this elaborate plan, you should give him your best clothes, you should put him on your best horse, you should have one of your nobles you lead him around and tell people how great he is. Wink, wink. And then the king says, I love it. Everything you just said, I love it. Go get Mordecai and do all of that for him. You. Don't tell someone else to do it. I want you to go get your sworn enemy. I want you to dress him. Do you see the servant? I mean, do you see the picture? I want you to personally dress Mordecai in my clothes, and then I want you to take him to my horse, and I want you to lift him up onto my horse, and then I want you to take the reins of that horse, and I want you to walk Mordecai the Jew around Susa the citadel, crying out, this is what happens to someone that the king wants to honor. What is it that has been burning Haman's biscuits the whole story? What does he want from Mordecai? He wants Mordecai to bow down and honor him in front of everyone. He wants Mordecai to humble himself before him. And how has God turned this around? Haman now, in front of everybody, has to not dress him. He dresses him privately. He has to put him on a horse, lead him around the city on a horse, shouting out, this is what happens to someone the king wants to honor. Just sit in that moment. That is a beautiful comic moment. That is the moment of, especially for a downtrodden people like the Jews, who their whole life and their whole history is people wanting to kill them, people wanting to put them down, being the outcasts. To read this story and to picture your worst enemy who has nothing but planned your demise, for God to force him to honor you publicly, for God to force him to humiliate him. There's Schadenfreude. There's this joy that comes to see your enemy put down. And sometimes we're too spiritual for that, and but there's a lot of Psalms that talk about, God, this is what I'd like to see you do to my enemies. I'm not going to take it into my own hands, and I'm not going to do it myself, but I would love for you to humble my enemies. I would love for you to take my enemies down. So how does all of this apply to us? It's a beautiful story, and I could read it over and over and over again, picture it over and over and over again. But how does this work? What should we do with it? I think Psalm 27 tells us exactly what we should do with it. So I want to end with that. On the back of your handout, you have it written out for you. And I want you to look at two things. I'm going to read it. And as we read it, I want you to look for God is. What does it say God is? As we go through there. God is, I'll just give you the first one. The Lord is my light and my salvation. So God is what? My light. God is my salvation. Those are the first two. I'm going to make you get the rest of them. So I'm going to read down through. And then as you're also thinking of God is, and somebody said stronghold, right? Yes. So light, salvation, stronghold. As you're thinking about God is, then also I will. What does the psalmist say he's going to do because of who God is? God is this, and so I will this. God is this, so I will this. Do you have? Yes. Thank you, Anastasia. Because of who God is, this is my response. I will not fear. All right, so I'm going to read down through these. You be writing, scribbling furiously as I do. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When evildoers assail me to eat up my flesh, my adversaries and foes. It is they. Do you hear Esther in this? It is they who stumble and fall. Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war rise against me, yet I will be confident. One thing have I asked of the Lord that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. For he will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will lift me high upon a rock. And now my head shall be lifted up above my enemies all around me. And I will offer in his tent sacrifices with shouts of joy. I will sing and make melody to the Lord. Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud. Be gracious to me and answer me. You have said, seek my face. My heart says to you, your face, Lord, do I seek. Hide not your face from me. Turn not your servant away in anger. O you who have been my help. Cast me not off. Forsake me not, O God of my salvation. For my father and my mother have forsaken me, but the Lord will take me in. Teach me your way, O Lord, and lead me on a level path because of my enemies. Give me not up to the will of my adversaries, for false witnesses have risen against me, and they breathe out violence. I believe that I shall look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. All right, God is. What is God? Come on.
Beautiful.
He's beautiful. He is beautiful. What is God? We already said he's our light. He's our salvation. He's our stronghold. He's beautiful. He is my help. He hides us in the cover of his tent. He lifts us up. God, my Savior. My rock, my salvation, my shelter. What was that what you used? My shelter. My help. Yeah. My protection. My master. He is good. He is our teacher. He is our leader. All right, so because God is all of that, how do we respond to a God like that? What do we do? How do we live? I will be confident. I will not fear. We wait for the Lord. That word wait, I looked up the Hebrew word. It means wait and it means hope. We will wait for the Lord. We will hope in the Lord. We will gaze on the Lord. Yes, your face I will seek. We will sing to him with joy, with shouts of joy. No, we will offer sacrifices with shouts of joy. We will sing. I will believe that I will see the goodness of the Lord. The last verse, I will take courage. I will be strong. You see the kind of people, the way we live when we really believe that God is not just working through us, but he's working beyond us? We are a strong, courageous, confident people. Because even the things that get past me, and the things that I can't plan for, and the things that I can't account for, and the people that are beyond my control, I know that there is a God who can keep them awake at night. There is a God who can play them like a puppet. There's a God who has my story and is writing my story. And no matter how dark it is at the end of chapter 5 or how dark it is in chapter 3, when there's this edict that every single Jew will be killed, annihilated, and destroyed, that God has not missed this, that God has not forgotten about me, that there is a God who is working not just through me, but beyond me. And when we grasp that, worry and fear do not live together with courage and confidence. You have to choose. Am I going to live in worry and fear? Or am I going to choose to believe what God has said and who God is and that God is working, even though I cannot see it and though I don't understand it? Will you be confident? Will you take courage? Take courage. Whom shall I fear? If the Lord is with me, whom shall I fear? If it's me and God, then who am I worried about going up against? The Lord is my light. Can I have the worship team come up? The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? If God is my light and salvation and God is my stronghold, you tell me who ought to make me nervous. Isn't that, Haman doesn't make you nervous. Xerxes, the king of the world, doesn't make you nervous. Because God is my light and my salvation and my stronghold.